Chapter 8. It was strange seeing Widow Horcata sitting in their kitchen with Grandpère fussing around her. She and Maman were polite to each other, but no more than that. She listened intently as Papa told her the plan. When it was over, she sat back in her chair and wrinkled her nose. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know. It seems to me the more people you tell, the greater the risk that someone will talk, and you want to tell everyone."
"But don't you see, Alice," said Grandpère, "everyone has to know. We need them to know, else they won't all come to the concert, will they? And how else are we going to find enough clothes for the children, eh? Then we got to find a place for them to sleep at night before, and a family to look after them on the way up to the hunt. And they've all got to act like they know the children. It just won't work unless everyone knows."
"I know that," said the widow. "But how can they all be trusted? Can you be sure of them, of every one of them? Madame Soulet, Armand Jolette?" No one answered. She went on. "All you need is one of them to take fright, and after all, they'll know what happened to them if they're caught." "You knew," said Maman quickly, "and so did Joe, and so did Grandpère. It didn't stop any of you from doing what was right, did it?" The widow looked at her sharply. "No one's going to give them away," Maman went on. "Because if they did, they'd know it wouldn't just be the children in the cave who'd suffer. It would be all of us, the whole of the village, everyone they've grown up with, all of us."
"That's the beauty of it, Alice," said Grandpère. "Don't you see? We're all in it together, sink or swim. That's why everyone has to be part of it. And they'll want to be too when they hear about the children. There's some good folk in this village, and they'll bring the others along with them."
"They'll be frightened," said Maman, "like I was when Grandpère told me all about Joe and you and those children up in the cave. And I'll tell you something else. I'm still frightened, but I know it has to be done, and so will they. They'll do it. You'll see." Widow Horcata smiled at Maman and chuckled. "You've got some spirit in you, girl," she said. "More than you ever let on, eh?" Joe had never heard his mother so forthright, so determined.
"Well," Papa said, "do we do it or don't we? We can't stay talking about it forever."
The widow Horcata looked at him steadily and took a deep breath. "We do it," she said, "and may God help us."
"Amen,"
said Grandpère. They spent the next hour or so compiling a list of names.
"We've got to see every single one of them," said Papa. "Monsieur Sarthal first, then Fatherless I. If he won't help us out with the concert, then we'll have to call it off anyway. And then Monsieur Audap to see if he'll let the children off school on Monday. We need the children. More than anyone, we need the children. All of them."
Fatherless I announced the concert during Mass. Everyone had been told about it by now and was expecting it, except for the soldiers, of course. Looking directly at Lieutenant Weissman and the dozen or so soldiers sitting with him, Fatherless I spoke with his usual intoning drone, but also with the authority of a man who was used to commanding attention.
"For 3 months every summer," he said, "our small community loses many of its menfolk. As we all know, on Monday next begins the great exodus, the transhumance, the beginning of months of solitude and hard work. In Lescon it has always been thus. Now I have lived here amongst you for most of my life, long enough to know that some of these men might want to spend their last evening in the café, and that is something I would not wish to deny them even if I could. So by all means go to the café, but I want everyone, and I do mean everyone, to come here to the church afterwards."
Joe was looking along the pew toward the soldiers. He wanted to watch their faces for any flicker of disbelief. The corporal leaned forward and winked at him, and Joe looked away quickly.
"Vanity, vanity, saith the preacher. All is vanity," said Fatherless I, smiling broadly and putting his hand on his heart. "And I confess freely to a great vanity. As you know, for many long hours I sit alone at the organ here in the church as I practice. And I have been practicing some of the greatest organ music ever written. And it was written by a German, too, one Johann Sebastian Bach. But for a musician, practice is not enough. I must perform. My music must be heard. From time to time in the past I have given recitals, and so tonight, to mark the eve of the transhumance, I will be giving you one of my short concerts, and I want all of you here, a gathering of the entire community, every man, woman, and child. No child is ever too young for Bach." He leaned forward over the pulpit, his eyes raking the pews, his finger pointing. "And you can be sure I shall know if you're not here." There was some laughter with that, and then he spoke directly to Lieutenant Weissman. "The music, as I have said, will be German, Lieutenant. I know how fond you are of Bach, and since it was written to glorify the God of both of our peoples, you and your men will be most welcome. Catholic and Protestant, all will be welcome. Indeed, Lieutenant, I will be the most disappointed if the entire German garrison is not here. Can I count on you, Lieutenant?" The lieutenant nodded, smiling. "That is kind of you, Lieutenant. I shall reserve seats for you. The concert will begin at 8 o'clock, and so it should be over well before curfew." It was a masterly performance. Fatherless I's concerts were rarely well attended. That evening, though, the church was as full as Joe had ever seen it. But by 5 to 8, the German soldiers had still not arrived. Joe sat next to Maman, her hand squeezing his. He squeezed back to reassure and be reassured. They would come. They had to come. Christine sat on the other side of her, thumb in her mouth, her legs swinging. The church was silent with expectation. Not a murmur, not a cough. Joe turned and craned his neck. Still nothing. Maman pulled on his hand and he turned back again. The bells groaned in the tower and struck 8 o'clock. Fatherless I emerged from the vestry and looked at the empty pews where the soldiers should have been. He seemed uncertain what to do. At that moment the lieutenant strode in, cap under his arm, the soldiers trooping in behind him. The sigh of relief was almost audible. Joe counted them in as Fatherless I took his seat at the organ. 22! They were all there! Last to take their seats was the mayor and Hubert. As they sat down in front of Joe, he heard the doors behind him close. The first piping notes sounded out through the church. Joe shivered. Whether through pleasure or relief, he did not know. From where he sat, he could just see Fatherless I's head rocking back and forth, and the back of his heels stepping neatly across the foot pedals. Even the smallest children, Christine among them, were immediately absorbed in the music. Hubert was lost in it, his mouth open, his head nodding, but Joe found he could not keep his eyes off the clock. He knew they needed at least an hour to be sure, an hour without soldiers on the streets, a clear hour to bring the children down from the cave, to hide them away in their allotted houses. Joe ventured a look at the corporal. He was gazing up at the roof, and his fingers were tapping out the rhythm on his knees. At long last, 9 o'clock struck in a horrible disharmony with the organ. Fatherless I played on. There was a certain amount of shuffling and coughing now as people began to become more uncomfortable, and the music too repetitive to hold their attention. Joe glanced across at Lieutenant Weissman, who was looking at his watch and whispering to the corporal beside him. The corporal shrugged his shoulders and smiled, and then took out his kerchief and blew his nose noisily. "Keep going, Father," Joe said to himself. "Keep going, keep going." Hubert was fidgeting now and looking round the church through his binoculars until his father put a firm hand on his wrist and pulled his arm downwards. Hubert was not so easily deterred. Much to everyone's amusement, he trained his binoculars on Fatherless I and then on each of the soldiers in return. It was not far short of 9:30 when the music built to a final crescendo, leaving the church filled with a throbbing silence. The mayor and Hubert led the enthusiastic applause, and the Fatherless I came out to take his bows. He held up his hands and shrugged his shoulders. "I'm afraid it lasted a little longer than expected," he said. "Good night, and God bless you." Lieutenant Weissman shook his hand and then came over to talk with the mayor, who nodded and turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "the lieutenant has asked me to say that the curfew is extended by half an hour tonight to allow us to get home at our ease. He asks all to be home by 10 o'clock. Joe danced his way through the crowd outside the porch and ran all the way home. He found Papa and Grandpère sitting at the kitchen table.
Grandpère was pouring wine. "Are they here?" he said.
"Up in the hayloft," said Grandpère. "All 3 of them."
"Did you get them all?" said Joe.
"All of them," said Papa. "And they're all where they should be. We did it in under an hour."
Joe climbed the ladder at the back of the barn and pushed open the loft door. "Joe?" It was Benjamin's voice whispering out of the darkness.
"Is that you, Joe?"
"It's me," he said, and he hauled himself up into the loft.
"Leah's fast asleep,"
said Benjamin, and in the darkness Joe could just make out her curled up tight against him, an arm thrown around his knee. "I'm not." It was Michael, crawling towards them through the hay. "Here," he said, "I brought you this." He was trying to thrust something into Joe's hand. "It's something you always wanted," he said. "Something you could never win. Squeeze it," he said, "and it'll bring you luck." It was a chess piece, a white queen.
"I've told him, Joe," said Benjamin. "I've told him that for tomorrow he's your brother. And do you know what he's told me, this horrible boy? He said if you were his brother, he'd have taught you to play chess a lot better than you do."
And then Joe saw Benjamin's face silhouetted for a moment against the window behind him.
"You cut your beard off," said Joe. "Your father's orders."
Benjamin stroked his chin.
"If you want to be taken for a native," he said, "then you've got to look like one. It seems there's not many people around here with a red beard, so off it had to come. I feel a bit naked without it, a bit cold too. Still, it'll grow again. It had better do, hadn't it? Or Anya won't recognize me when she sees me."
"You're staying behind, then?" said Joe.
"Yes," said Benjamin. "I'll see them safely over the border, and then I'll come back."
He put his arm around him.
"Joe," he said, "I feel surer than ever that somehow Anya will find her way here. You remember what I said to you a while back when I hurt my ankle, when the snows came and it all looked hopeless? You remember what I said? I said, wait and pray. Well, we waited and we prayed, and here we are. This time tomorrow, God willing, the children will be in Spain and they'll be safe at last. So I shall wait up in the cave for Anya, and I shall pray."
When Joe went down to the kitchen, they were all there, and Papa was crouching down in front of Christine and holding her hands. There was an edge of impatience in his voice.
"Forget about the donkey, Christine. Just remember, stay with Joe. You clap your hands when he does, you chase the sheep like Rolf does, and if anyone asks, you've got a big sister called Leah and a big brother called Michael. Do you understand now?"
"But I haven't got a big sister," she said, "and my big brother's called Joe." Papa gave up, and Maman took his place. "It's pretend, Christine," she said, "just for tomorrow. You've got a pretend sister, and she's called Leah, and you've got a pretend brother, and he's called Michael, and you've got to look after them. No squabbling." "But I can ride the donkey," she said, and everyone had to laugh. When she'd gone up to bed, Papa stretched out in his chair, and Grandpère lit his last cigarette of the day. He'd always had a last one, usually several of them, before he went to bed.
"Some people," he said, "are so predictable. You know what Armand Jolette said when I told him? He said he ought to be compensated. Compensated! You know what he said? He said, 'If I go with you, then I'll have to close up the shop for a whole day, and that'll cost me.' And his chin shook like an agitated turkey. You should have seen him."
"Money," said Maman. "It's all that man ever thinks of."
"I've never really talked much to the schoolmaster, that Monsieur Audap," said Papa. "I always thought he was a strange fish, but he's not. He's a fine man. When I told him all about it and asked him about giving the children a day off of school, he thought for a moment, and I was sure he was going to refuse. He always looks like such a miserable old so-and-so. Do you know what he said, Joe? He said the children would likely learn more in that one day than he could teach them in a lifetime. Nothing's important unless it stays with you. That's what he said. And no matter what happens, none of us, he said, none of us is ever likely to forget tomorrow."
Joe did not even try to sleep that night. He knew it would be pointless. His mind went over the plan again and again. He tried to visualize it as the soldiers would see it. Would it all look normal to them? Would they notice all the extra children in amongst the animals? Would they catch a glimpse of Benjamin's face and know him for a stranger? He could almost convince himself that it was going to work, that the Germans would only see what they were supposed to see. But as the night wore on, a terrible doubt kept reoccurring. It was something the corporal had told him a long time ago. He'd come from a village in the mountains, in Bavaria, just like Lescon, he'd said. Well, Joe thought, if it was a lot like Lescon, then he'd know that you don't need dozens and dozens of children to drive the animals. He'd know you can do the job with a few men and a couple of dogs. And he'd know, too, that the flocks and herds were moved out separately and not in one great chaotic bunch. The more Joe saw it through the corporal's eyes, the more he worried. And by dawn, a multitude of nagging doubts had eclipsed his hopes. He faced the day ahead with a deep dread welling inside of him. At breakfast, he recognized the same anxiety in Maman's eyes. Papa and Grandpère were still arguing on and on about who would be best to stay with the children in the hut and guide them over the mountains. Grandpère said that he was fitter, that Papa's coughing could give them away. Papa said he was younger and that anyway he knew the mountains better. At one point, they were going to do it together, but Maman would have none of that. She said it was silly for the two of them to take the risk of getting caught. In the end, it was Papa who had his way. Leah and Michael looked awkward in their country clothes. They ate ravenously and in silence. Christine just stared at them and refused to eat her breakfast. "Time to go, I think," said Papa. Benjamin finished his coffee and stood up. "Monsieur, Madame," he said, "I hardly know you, but before we leave, I want to thank you, and through you and all the people of this village for what you have done and what you are about to do. What has happened here in this little place, whether it succeeds or whether it fails, is evidence enough, if any were needed, that no one will ever suppress the power for good, for compassion in the hearts of men and women. I have one regret, though, that my little Anya is not here yet. But when she comes, I shall tell her often so she can tell her children. Such things should not be forgotten. And now, if you would allow me, I will say a prayer. It is the last prayer we Jews say before we leave the synagogue." He closed his eyes. "And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall the Lord be one and his name be one." Rolf lay stretched out like a carpet by the stove, with Leah crouched beside him, stroking the top of his head. She leaned over and kissed him. "Joe," said Papa, "you better wake that dog up. We can't move those sheep without him." Joe whistled, and Rolf woke, a look of resignation on his face. He yawned noisily, and Leah laughed and sat back on her haunches as he stretched, shook himself awake, and then led them outdoors into the yard. The streets were already full of sheep noise, a cacophony of bells and bleating, claiming a brass line in the raucous choir, the cows bellowing and the donkeys brayed. The first flock came past them, Lawrence driving them with his stick. He was leading a heavily laden donkey that stepped daintily over the cobbles. He winked at Joe as he passed and grinned. He was enjoying every minute of it. He had 2 of the cave children with him. They looked for all the world just like the village children around them, like they carried switches and sticks, and like them, they whistled and shouted and clapped. 2 more flocks and a herd of cows came by, and Joe counted at least 5 more children from the cave. Now it was their turn. Hubert was sitting on the wall, laughing and pointing as they gathered up the sheep in the yard. Joe shouted to him to open the gate, and he began to flap his arms and whistle. Michael followed his example at once with uninhibited enthusiasm. When Benjamin, too, turned shepherd, Leah seemed to warm to the idea and joined in as well. As he left the yard, Joe turned and waved to Grandpère and Papa. They'd be coming on behind with the pigs and the donkeys. By the time they reached the square, Joe saw that the flocks had bunched together, and every street leading it was thick with sheep and cattle. The noise was deafening, an incessant chorus of animals punctuated with whooping and whistling and barking. Joe saw a sheep burst through the front door of Monsieur Sarthal's house. A dog went in after it. Joe never saw what happened, for his eye was taken by something far more worrying. 3 soldiers, one of them the corporal, were standing on top of the wall by the war memorial and watching everything that passed through the square below them. Joe looked away quickly and whooped even louder at the sheep. A cow was rubbing itself against the corner of the cafe, and the soldiers were laughing. Benjamin was keeping his head down, as Papa had suggested he should. But to Joe, his shepherding looked somehow forced and stiff, and then he felt Leah clutching his arm. She had seen the soldiers and was looking up at them, her eyes wide with terror. The corporal was looking right at her, and the sheep would not move on. There was nothing Joe could do. There were sheep behind him, sheep in front of him, sheep all around him. The corporal had let himself down off the wall and was scrutinizing them closely. He had noticed something. Joe was sure of it. Why Hubert chose that moment to perform, Joe never knew, but he pushed his way through the sheep and began to leap up and down like a wild thing, and then raising his arm in the air, he growled at the sheep like a bear. The corporal pointed and laughed, and the other soldiers laughed with him. Hubert saw it and performed his bear act again, but with redoubled vigor. All around him, the sheep panicked. They pushed and shoved and jumped over each other, and at last the great flock began to move again up past the baker's shop. Joe slipped around the back of Leah, ostensibly to chase a sheep, but this way he'd be between her and the soldiers, so that she could not be seen by them, and they could not see her. He dared not venture another look at the soldiers until they left the square behind them. When he did turn round, the corporal was looking straight at him. Joe turned away quickly and played shepherd again. So the chaotic cavalcade wound its way slowly out of the village and up towards the hill beyond. They could see the circle of mountains ahead of them. All around him Joe could see and feel the exhilaration and relief. The ruse had surely worked. The cave children had passed undetected under the nose of the Germans. The worst must be over. Even Rolf seems to sense a triumph. He was chasing his tail, and he only did that on days where he was high with happiness. But Joe could not share in the general elation. He could think only of the patrols that they might meet before they reached the high pastures and the hut. But worse, he could not get out of his head that the corporal had guessed what they were up to. There had been a look in his eye. He was certain of it. A knowing look.
"We must make it look like a fete, a holiday," Papa had said. "We don't hurry it, we enjoy it." And so they did. They reached the plateau by lunchtime. They picnicked by the stream, and the animals browsed hungrily in the lush grass. They did not wander far because they did not need to. It was proving almost impossible to keep the cave children away from each other. Benjamin spent his time persuading them to stay with their newly adopted families, but in spite of all he could do, they always seemed to gravitate to each other again. It wasn't that the language was a barrier between them and the village children. After all, some of the cave children were French, but there seemed to be an instinctive reserve that kept them apart. It was only when Hubert appeared lumbering across the stream, 4 children clinging to his back, that they all found a mutual source of fun that brought cave children and village children together. Hubert, the great giant, had to be hauled down and held down, and it took almost all of them to do it. In the pile of children on top of him, they were all allies in this one cause. Michael and Laurent clung to the same leg and were shaken off. They rolled away together, giggling, before returning once more to the fray. The afternoon climb was slow. It was steep now, up along narrow, tortuous tracks where the sheep could only move in single file. The pigs hated climbing and were forever trying to wander off, and the cows too had had enough of it now. For many of the children, the adventure had lost its early magic. Their legs ached, their feet hurt, and many of them had to ride. Every donkey now, every horse was carrying at least one child. Christine insisted on sharing a donkey with Leah. Michael's leg had lasted well until he stumbled and fell. He limped for a bit until Hubert noticed him. He led Michael to a rock and crouched down in front of it. Michael climbed on and rode Hubert all the way up. And so they came at long last to the high pastures, the horses first, then the sheep, the cows, and the last of all the reluctant pigs, and in amongst them all the 100 or so men, women, and children who had brought them there. They lay down, man and beast, side by side, in silent exhaustion. They drank from the stream by the hut, or from the stream that flowed from it. Michael and Joe cupped their hands in the spring and drank until they could drink no more. When Joe looked up, the cave children were already being led towards the hut. "Come on," said Joe, and they stood up. "Is that Spain over there?" said Michael, looking up at the peaks. "That's Spain," said Joe. They parted at the door of the hut.
Don't lose my queen, will you?" said Michael, and he went into the hut with the others. When Joe turned round, Benjamin was standing in front of him, Leah at his side. "I'll be seeing you later then, Joe," he said. Leah reached up and kissed him on the cheek, and then she was gone. He heard Papa's voice from inside the hut. "Is that all of them? Have you counted them?" "That's all of them," said Benjamin. "All we've got to do now is wait until dark." Papa emerged from the hut and closed the door. "You'd better get back down the mountain," he said, and then his mouth fell open. He was looking over Joe's shoulder. Joe turned. Coming out of the trees were 3 soldiers. Everyone had seen them now. No one moved. No one said a word. There was no doubt about it. The one in front was the corporal.